Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. We're now just 4 months away from probably the most important election any of us has seen in our lifetimes. The question we're talking about today is if Trump loses the election, are there ways in which he could still hold on to the presidency? Are there ways that he could and is already laying the groundwork to make sure that he hangs on to office? This is a disturbing topic. This is not the stuff of fantasy. This is the stuff of real scenarios based on things that have actually happened in our election history in this country, based on the electoral college, based on the possibility that the election could end up, as many elections do, being closer than we like to think. My guest, Lawrence Douglas, who is a professor at Amherst College of Law, Jurisprudence, and Social Thought, has a new book out called Will He Go? Trump and the Looming Electoral Meltdown in 2020. And he explores all of this in the book, and he explores all of this with us on Good Law, Bad Law. So, everybody, please continue to take care. Wear a mask inside and in many places now outside. Be careful, be safe. Take care and enjoy this episode of Good Law, Bad Law, and please share it with your friends. Tell us what you think. Stay tuned. One of my all-time favorite political speeches was on election night of 2008, and you might think I'm referring to Barack Obama's speech in front of supporters when he came out to greet the crowds in Chicago. But actually, the speech that I remember so powerfully was the concession speech that John McCain gave. And one of the big reasons I remember it so well is it impressed on me at the time one of the things that is so wonderful about our democracy in this country for now over 230 years, which is the peaceful transition of power that takes place in our election of president every 4 years, except for a few times in our history where it hasn't been quite so smooth as all that. But the question here, as we look now ahead to the election in November, now just 4 months away, is the question that my guest today poses in the title of his book, his new book, Will He Go? Trump and the Looming Electoral Meltdown of 2020. So first of all, I want to welcome Lawrence Douglas to the program. Thank you, Lawrence, so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law to talk about this.
Really my pleasure to be with you, Aaron.
Now, I know that you teach law, jurisprudence, and social thought at Amherst College, that you have really incredibly impressive background. Uh, your undergraduate education at Brown, and then a master's degree at Columbia, my alma mater, and a law degree from Yale. And this is your seventh book, which is something of a departure from some of the things you've written about at other times. So maybe this is such a big question, and I think people aren't really yet fully confronting it. How this year, how this election, so important in the minds of millions and millions of Americans today, how this election could really be unprecedented in our country's history, or largely unprecedented, and for some pretty frightening reasons. Maybe we could start if you just tell us how you came to write this book and uh, how you tried to approach this question and why this is even a question.
Yeah, that's I think the first time I really started thinking about this issue was back in 2016, and this was during the last presidential debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And as some of your listeners no doubt recall, the moderator Chris Wallace asked Trump whether he would accept electoral defeat. And Trump, I think, shocked a lot of people by saying, look, keep you in suspense. He refused to say that he would accept defeat. And I remember at the time when I heard that, thinking, "Wow, that's a pretty dangerous thing for the representative of a major political party in the United States to say." And then the next moment that really struck me was this is right after his inauguration. This is no doubt something that your listeners will also remember, which is when he insisted that not only did he win the Electoral College, but he would have won the popular vote as well had it not been for 3 to 5 million illegal kind of phantom voters.
Right.
And at that moment, I really remember thinking, could you imagine if a incumbent president actually engaged in that kind of basically lies about an electoral outcome? And I really started thinking pretty seriously about the kind of damage that could be done to American constitutional democracy if you had not just a candidate, but you actually had an incumbent president rejecting electoral defeat.
So the big question you raise here is if in a close election, because if it's a landslide for Biden, and we now know it's Biden who's the Democrat running against him, if it's a landslide for Biden, it becomes much harder for Trump, even with all of his Twitter shenanigans and other things that he says, to really challenge the result. But in a close election, which seems more likely as we work our way through these last 4 months up to election day, um, what you're asking the question, even if he loses, um, he may not leave. And there may be scenarios, given the peculiarities of the way we elect presidents in this country, and even some precedent for thinking about these possibilities, uh, where he may not go. He may
Yes,
challenge
that's
where he may actually not leave office.
right, Aaron. Even though, again, one thing I would emphasize is the book is not meant to be, it's not meant to be kind of a speculative political thriller in the sense that I don't necessarily imagine Trump barricaded in the
Yeah.
Oval Office come noon on January 20th, surrounded by these rogue Secret Service agents. I mean, that's not really my imagining. It's much
Hmm.
more of what you were saying earlier, which was. I do think that if he loses decisively, his kind of constitutional brinkmanship, he'll be limited in his capacity to really damage our system. But if the outcome is close, and by close, again, we don't mean necessarily close in the popular vote. I mean, if you think back to 2016, it really wasn't that close in the popular vote. I
Right.
mean, Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes. Votes. It's a pretty substantial margin of victory. Not a huge margin of victory, but it's certainly not, a statistically insignificant one. Um, but if he loses in as the result of very close outcomes in a handful of swing states, and that's where the electoral decision turns on the outcomes in these swing states, then I really do think that we could really see him playing this kind of, constitutional or electoral brinkmanship, in which he insists that only fraud or corruption or some kind of tampering led to his defeat. And unfortunately, the way things are kind of lined up politically in this country right now is that kind of claim could gain a lot of traction and really could lead to a great deal of chaos.
Well, and he's also a different person and a different president than we've seen before in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm sure, those who will say, well, lots of presidents lie, and Trump has been associated with the full spectrum of falsehoods during his presidency, and they're well documented. But there is something different, categorically different about him as president than we've ever seen before. And you talk about this in the book, and maybe it's important perhaps to contrast him, say, with uh, say Al Gore in 2000, which was the last time we really had such a close election that there was a delay in acknowledging who the winner was of that race. Is that useful to talk about him as a person and why someone like Donald Trump would be the person who would engage in these types of, what you call brinkmanship or foul play or all kinds of ways that we could describe it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, when I'm talking about him as a person, I'm not a psychologist. I know there have been a lot of ink spilled on people trying to probe Donald Trump's psychology. I'm not about to do that. But what we can say is how he behaves as a politician. And we can say that he engages in really things that are unprecedented. And you're absolutely right to point out that, there have been many people who have lied, who have occupied the Oval Office. But there's something really quite unusual about Trump in that not only does he lie about accomplishments and all these other ways, not only does he, attack people in really acts that, in words that sound defamatory, but he attacks the integrity of our institutions themselves, and he undermines the faith that the people have that the democratic constitutional process is actually functioning. And
Mhm.
that's really unprecedented. You've never had a president who insists that our electoral system is untrustworthy. And that's an
Yeah.
incredibly dangerous thing to have. It's incredibly dangerous. I mean, it's one thing to have sort of some marginal conspiracy theory group insisting that the system is all rigged. It's another thing entirely to have the President of the United States spinning out these conspiracy theories and arguing that our system cannot be trusted. And and it's also, I think, valuable to kind of contrast his behavior to two of the people that you mentioned, Aaron, to John McCain and with Al Gore. And in both cases, you find candidates for the presidency very gracefully conceding defeat. And even in the book, I try to make a little bit of a distinction between conceding defeat and submitting to defeat.
Mhm.
And conceding defeat, I really think of as an act in which the loser recognizes the legitimacy of his loss. Basically says, we fought the good fight, we tried, and we ultimately did not prevail. And I
Mhm.
congratulate my opponent. I think it's impossible, really kind of impossible to imagine Trump doing that. That is, even if he submits to defeat, and by submitting I mean just kind of recognizes that further fight is futile. And I could imagine again him doing that if he is soundly defeated, only if
Yeah.
he is soundly defeated. But I could imagine him submitting, but I can't really imagine him conceding defeat. I just don't think that's. We have no reason to believe that he would do that based on his past behavior. So I'm not trying to disparage him personally. I'm just trying to say we can extrapolate from past behavior and predict how he's going to act in the future. So there's no way he's going to concede. He might submit if he is beaten badly, and he might not even submit if he's not beaten badly. I would suspect he will not, and that's where the brinkmanship comes in.
Well, and McCain, he did lose. I mean, there wasn't really anyone questioning the results of the election. He lost, and he was very gracious in conceding. He even referred to Obama in that speech as our president, and I thought was a really graceful move for the oppositional candidate to say, "This is now he is now my president. He is our president." And in Al Gore's case, he actually won the popular vote, not by as much as Hillary Clinton did, but he certainly won the popular vote and still lost and still had to concede in the end. And we don't have to tell the whole story about what happened with hanging chads in Florida and the Supreme Court and all, but you talk about it in the book. But I think really importantly in this case, and with this president and in this year, and you make the case for this, whether it's who he is and these are things he's just doing randomly without any plan because that's who he is and how he functions, or whether it's a kind of laying the groundwork for what he may do. He has been pretty consistent, as you say, in undermining the credibility of not only the electoral process. And you cite the example uh, from the 2016 election, which he won in the Electoral College and still was calling a rigged election, to his undermining of the authority of the media, of the Supreme Court, of the Democrats, of the Congress. I mean, he has left no stone unturned in that. And even just a few days ago, it didn't really get a lot of attention because there's so much else he's doing that's in the news in the last week or so. But even just a few days ago, he was tweeting about the 2020 election was rigged and was already declaring it rigged. So putting all those pieces together, what does that tell you about how this election could be different? I know there's a lot of different scenarios you explore. Um, we'll talk about some of the swing state scenarios that you look at, but still, sort of from 30,000 feet above, what does that behavior and how he seems to position himself on relative to these institutions um, tell give you such pause about what may or may not happen in a few months?
Right, and I think that the thing that you're referring to from last week is really very telling. I mean, this was a tweet that he issued just a few days ago, and
Yeah.
it went rigged 2020 election. Millions of mail-in ballots will be printed by foreign countries and
Right.
others. It will be the scandal of our times. And again, I think it really is kind of important for us all to bear in mind that he is scripting something in advance. He's
Yeah.
basically giving us, he's telegraphing his roadmap for challenging any kind of defeat that he might experience in 2020. And I think it is also, really instructive to go back to Al Gore, who you mentioned, and again,
Mhm.
without kind of going
Mhm.
back into the 2000 election in exhaustive detail, there are a lot of people who think that it was the Supreme Court, that brought closure to that election controversy. And remember, this is where it was an incredibly close count in Florida, and then about 35 days after the election, the Supreme Court basically stepped in and they stopped the Florida recount. And at the time,
Mhm.
Bush was only, he was clinging to a 537 vote lead, 537 votes.
Wow.
Um, and and a lot of people say, well, might have been a terrible decision on the court. It might have been poorly reasoned. It might have been highly partisan, but it was really important to get closure. Um, and that's what the court did. It provided closure, and I think that's wrong. I don't think it was the court that provided closure. It was Al Gore who provided closure because it was Gore who the very next day conceded defeat, and he
Mhm.
basically said, "I'm going to accept the Supreme Court's decision." And there were many people within his party. There were many people within his legal team who were urging him to continue the fight and to continue it through to Congress. Congress ultimately counts electoral votes come January. We might talk about this a little bit later if
Yep.
you'd like.
Yep.
Um, but um, but it was Gore who conceded, and I think it's impossible to imagine Trump behaving in a similar fashion in that situation,
Yeah.
conceding. I think there's no doubt that he would continue the fight. And if you start, again, kind of looking more closely into the way our electoral system works in contested situations, you realize that if you start pushing things in an election with an uncertain outcome, it can really lead to kind of a chaotic result. And so, given the sort of foibles of our electoral system, plus the fact that we know that Trump is already scripting his way to challenge an outcome or a close outcome by attacking the integrity of mail-in ballots, we really could be in for a very chaotic fall, and really from November through January.
Well, before we get into some of those scenarios, Lawrence, wondering about something else, and I think I know the answer, but I'd rather hear you say it and explain it.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, Trump is 74 years old. He's got, I mean, whether he's got millions or billions, who knows? He's got lots of money. What do we know about him and he is different in so many ways from anyone we've seen in the presidency before. But what is it you have observed about him that makes you think, even in defeat, he would be willing to engage in this type of language and these types of challenges in risking the chaos that could result, likely would result, if he challenged a loss on November 3rd? What about
Yeah.
him do you leads you to think that this is something he would actually do? Why not just sail off into the
Right.
sunset?
Right. Well, Aaron, again, I'm going to answer the question by, kind of not trying to probe psychology, but just
Yeah,
kind of
right.
make observations about him as a political actor. And it seems that we can pretty confidently say the following things. First of all, that most of the um, norms that usually restrain political actors, even if the political actors aren't, particularly good people, but they seem to be restrained by norms. He just ignores these norms. They seem to have no restraining effect on him whatsoever. And more troubling yet, he hasn't had to pay any kind of political price for his ignoring these norms. So you'd imagine that if someone goes ahead and abuses the office in the way he has, you would pay a political price. And we've seen that largely as a result of Republican lawmakers and the protection they're willing to afford him, that he just hasn't paid any political price whatsoever. It
Mhm.
also seems that his particular political style is very much built on tearing down and division. I mean, he really kind of thrives on chaos. And by thriving on chaos, I don't simply, I mean, in part, it actually goes to his managerial style. It seems that he is perfectly happy to preside over an incredibly chaotic White House.
Mhm.
Um, but his political style really seems to be one about division and teardown. That's how he succeeds politically. By so it's not as if taking the high road is has been the key to his political success. Quite to the contrary, he has reaped tremendous political rewards through this politics of division and teardown. And the other thing I think we should mention is how important brand protection seems to be for him. He seems to have very little what we might describe as any kind of notions of civic duty or civic virtue or respect for our constitutional traditions. He seems to be really interested in brand protection.
Yeah.
And part of the brand protection requires that he always be a winner, and that if he ever loses, that he blames it on fraud. And again, this is not really speculative. I mean, we've seen a long pattern of this. It goes all the
Yes.
way back to the Iowa caucus. He loses the Iowa caucus to Ted Cruz, and immediately the next day he's out tweeting it was fraud, it was a hoax. That's why I lost the Iowa caucus. Um, the idea of taking the high road and Trump, those are two concepts that just don't really go together.
Well, but also from a strategic standpoint, if again, I don't know whether it's conscious and deliberate or whether it's just who he is and it's just how things play out with him. But from a strategic point of view, if you tear down all the institutions around you and everybody around you who opposes you in any way or criticizes you, and you're successful at that, and there are lots and lots of his supporters. We refer to his base. I don't know what the base is, or if how big it is, or if it's bigger or small or anything. But this base of support that he has, that all that's left to believe in is him, is his word, and that's also very dangerous, but very potent if he's successful. And he's been very successful at
Yes, and again, we don't need to decide whether it's something that he does as a tactical and strategic matter, or if it's just something kind of reflexive that he does. But
that.
he does have a kind of, there's a little bit of some genius in his ability to kind of tear down and make these tear downs stick. I mean, you see that he, tears down Robert Mueller, and that sticks. He tears down James Comey, and it sticks. He tears down John McCain, and it sticks. And it doesn't necessarily stick with all Americans. In fact, it repels tens of millions of Americans, and yet it sticks with many of his supporters. And of course, this might be obvious, but it's worth emphasizing. One of the reasons it sticks is not simply because he's saying it, but because his message gets endlessly repeated and amplified by the right wing media, by the likes of Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh. And if those are your only sources of information, you're basically just going to have it's almost an echo chamber that you have everything he
Right.
says confirmed, reconfirmed, and amplified. And again, that's been an incredibly destructive for our civic discourse.
Well, and the other factor, and again, you talk about this in the book as well, and we're still, I think, setting up here, which is why would President Trump, even in defeat, cling to office, even if doing so would provoke even more chaos, maybe even violence in this country. I mean, it's not far fetched to imagine that. But another factor is that he may face criminal liability for certain conduct while in office that he is protected against while he's in office. And so, unless he figures out how to engineer a pardon the way Nixon did by resigning and having his successor pardon him, that's the last time I can think of where a president, faced the prospect of leaving office and perhaps facing jail. And I
Yeah,
think
that's right.
a lot of people think that could be very much in his mind, not only for himself but for his family.
That's right. And yeah, I mean, it certainly could be that one of the motivations for trying to, or the desire to remain in office is to avoid legal exposure and potentially, yeah, being tried on criminal charges. And it's also possible that if you remained in office through, let's say, 2024, that the statute of limitations on some of the acts he could arguably be charged with, things like obstruction of justice, that statute of limitations would have told, and so he would no longer be vulnerable to prosecution come 2024 if he were able to remain in office. Um, I mean, he is, obviously, even just beyond that, he's just such a different kind of political animal because he really doesn't seem like he's interested in exercising political power per se. It really seems like what he is most interested in is just um, being in the public eye, of just kind of monopolizing and hogging attention. And the presidency seems to provide him with just a fantastic opportunity to do that. And
Sure.
so it's not as
Yeah.
if he uses public attention as a tool for pursuing his political agenda. It's more like he has a political agenda simply for the purpose that of keeping himself the center of attention.
Yeah. His
Very
personal.
unusual.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with the Electoral College, but it is very confusing. Most people looking at the upcoming election think, unless there's some dramatic change between now and November, that Biden is on track to win again, as Clinton did 4 years ago, to win the popular vote. But of course, you have to win 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. Um, what what do you think? And maybe it'd be helpful to take one of the scenarios, maybe the one you think most likely to uh, to result in a melt in this meltdown uh, that you are exploring, um, to help us walk through some of the steps that would happen. Um, I mean, this is real. This is
Hmm.
not far fetched at all. This is real. The way things work in our system of electing presidents. Um, well, what maybe you could take the Pennsylvania example for one, because that's my
Yeah.
state, and that's really compelling when you think about how things could actually play out here.
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, and again, we don't need to really kind of go into the to the details of the electoral college, but I think it is worth just reminding everyone that we really have an incredibly anachronistic and arguably a dysfunctional system for electing the president of the United States. Um, let's put it this way: that if we didn't have the Electoral College, if someone said to us, "Oops, look, we suddenly have to come up with a new system for electing the president now in 2020," there is no way that anyone would come up with anything remotely resembling the Electoral College.
Yeah.
And through the entire 20th century, people avoided. They talked about getting rid of the Electoral College. Remains very unpopular with the American public. But at least through the 20th century, it never produced this really dramatically anti-democratic result in which the popular vote loser wins the White House. And now that's already happened twice in the 21st century, and it arguably could happen again in 2020. And then the other thing that, of course, is what I really kind of spell out in the book is how the Electoral College, and this is something we all know, but it is an incredible vulnerability of the system, how it focuses all our attention on a handful of swing states.
Yeah.
And so the results in, the results in California, New York, all these states, they become irrelevant because everyone knows, oh, Biden's going to win California. Biden's going to win New York. And so it turns all this attention on states
And the
like Pennsylvania.
corresponding red states, and the corresponding red
But
states too. You never
yes,
hear
yes,
anyone
exactly.
about Arkansas or
Oh, of
Mississippi in the
course,
presidential race. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Sorry.
And
Go ahead.
yeah, and so it trains all our attention on a handful of these swing states. In 2016, the swing states were Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And we should remember that in 2016, only 70,000 votes separated Clinton from victory in those three states combined. And again, 75, that's again, it's
It's
a
nothing.
tiny
Yeah.
fraction of votes. And I mean, it's more than the 537 in Florida in 2000, but still, it's
Yeah.
a tiny fraction of the total number of votes being cast in the country. And that's where things can really go south. And if I can actually, would you mind if I talk about the blue shift problem, because that's the one that I think is the one that we really need to be concerned about in come this fall.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah,
That takes
can I go into
mail-in
that one?
ballots. Yeah. That's
Yes,
right. You're
because
right.
it has to go
Mail-in
with
ballots is big. Mm.
exactly. It has to go to this whole issue of mail-in ballots. So
Right. Right.
one of the things that your listeners might be curious about is, why is he constantly attacking the integrity of these mail-in ballots now, even months before the election? And because it is the case that both Republicans and Democrats rely on mail-in ballots. But I think one of the things he's well aware of is that come November, there'll be a lot of people wanting to use mail-in ballots who live in densely populated urban areas. And because those are the people who would arguably be exposing themselves to the greatest health risks by voting in person.
Yeah.
And again, mail-in ballots are nothing new. In 2016, about 25 million, more than 25 million Americans cast mail-in ballots. People now predict that in 2020, as much as depending on where you are, like 70% of ballots could be mail-in ballots.
Mm.
So, what's the problem with all these mail-in ballots being used in heavily populated urban areas? And there, I think it's probably a lot of us can conclude that, well, heavily populated, densely populated urban areas tend to vote Democratic, and often they tend to be multi-ethnic, and often vote overwhelmingly Democratic. And so it is certainly in Trump and the Republicans' interest, to try to suppress urban voters from getting access to mail-in ballots. Um, Basically, deny them access to the mail-in ballots, and then force them to basically say, "I'm either going to take my health, I'm going to risk my health by voting in person, or I'm not going to vote at all." That's one
When you
thing.
And when you say health, that's because many people predict we're still going to be in the throes of the pandemic, and therefore in-person voting has obvious risks to it versus mailing in your ballot from home.
That's exactly right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And even, we saw this spring in Wisconsin in, April when they had their primary and also a local election. We saw that as a result of COVID in Milwaukee, there were supposed to be 180 polling places open, but as a result of health concerns, only 5 were open.
Yeah.
And and so you also have polling workers who don't want to be exposed to these health risks. So, and obviously we're talking about Milwaukee as a heavily minority and Democratic voting base. So that's one thing, voter suppression. But then, here, Aaron, this is where we get into kind of the nitty gritty of mail-in ballots. The other thing that I think Trump is trying to do in attacking the integrity of mail-in ballots is he's trying to, again, script a way to challenge the following kind of outcome. So one thing about mail-in ballots is very often they're not even received until days after the election. Actually, I was interviewed by European political correspondent who said, well, according to U.S. federal law, when do mail-in ballots have to be counted by? And when I stopped laughing, I pointed out to the correspondent, we don't have a federal law that controls that. It's all up to states. So
Yeah.
some states could say something like the mail-in ballots have to be received on election day. Some say they just have to be counted by 5 days after the election. Some say a week after the election. It's all up in the air. And so you could imagine the following scenario. November 3rd, and we'll take the state of Pennsylvania. On November 3rd, Trump seems to have a very narrow lead in Pennsylvania. He leads by, let's say, we'll make it up, 10,000 votes on November 3rd. And if he wins Pennsylvania, let's say he wins the election. But as Pennsylvania begins to count its mail-in ballots, that lead vanishes. And by the time that Pennsylvania finishes its canvass of mail-in ballots, and let's say it takes it, 10 days or so, let's say on November 15th, they say, it looks like Biden has now won the state by, we'll make it up, 25,000 votes. All along, Trump has been tweeting, we can't accept these mail-in ballots. They've been corrupted. They're full of fraudulent votes. We have to go with the November 3rd results. And again, you might say, well, now you're being speculative. You're putting words in Trump's mouth. And again, there's not speculation. He did the exact same thing in 2018. In 2018, in Florida, there was a Senate race in which Rick Scott won. On election day, Rick Scott had a lead of about 56,000 votes. And by the time Florida finished the canvass of all the kind of provisional and mail-in ballots, that lead had decreased to a very uncomfortable 10,000 vote margin.
Yeah.
And Trump was very concerned that Scott was going to lose ultimately. So all along, he was tweeting away saying, fraudulent votes coming in. We have to go with the election day result.
Well, Lawrence, there's another example
yeah.
you talk about in the book, which actually shows the power is even stronger evidence of the power of the blue shift, and that's the Arizona Senate race from that same election year, right? Because not only did the lead shrink, it actually reversed once all ballots were counted.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that was one in so in Arizona in 2018. So this again, the senatorial race. This was the GOP candidate was this Martha McSally, and she had I think a 15,000 vote lead on election day, and by the time the canvass was over, Kirsten Sinema had won the state by 56,000 votes.
Right, that's
it was
a huge
70,000 vote shift. I mean, That's very dramatic. And Trump is well aware of that phenomenon, well aware of that
Mhm.
phenomena. And as you point out, it's been given the name blue shift. There's an election law expert named Ned Foley who calls it blue shift. Um, and so I think he is really trying to kind of create a way um, of he's trying to script a way to challenge any loss that results from this blue shift.
And
Um,
there's no
Now,
reason to
I'm sorry.
actually think that mail-in ballots are less reliable or less valid or more subject to fraud uh, than any other kind of vote casting. Is there? I mean, there's nothing to
No,
what he's
there's no
saying.
right. There's no reason to say that, which is not to say that they can't be vulnerable. I think many electoral systems are certainly vulnerable, uh, but it's certainly to say that they are not more vulnerable than other systems. And in fact, some of the claims that have been made by actually not just Trump himself, but unfortunately by our attorney general, our chief law enforcement officer of the United States, by Bill Barr, who seems prepared to back up anything that Trump says nowadays. Bill Barr, about a week and a half ago, said, well, it's possible that a foreign nation could print up, millions of these mail-in ballots and just inundate our system with it, which is, again, kind of a shockingly irresponsible thing for the Attorney General of the United States to say. And it really betrays an ignorance about the way mail-in ballots function, because these things, they have barcodes on them. They have
Yeah,
zebra stripes on them.
yeah,
They have to be read. I mean, you can't just, they're not like regular envelopes. It's not like you can just print up, in your basement a bunch of like hoax, fraudulent ballots and just mail it to a bunch of people. That's not the way it works. So,
right.
um, and again, the one thing I should also though mention is they do have to be counted, these mail-in ballots, and people are going to be having to count them under tremendous amounts of time pressure, and very often they're going to be these overworked and maybe undertrained election officials, and they probably will make mistakes, and they can make harmless error. But the problem with that, of course, is that once any reports of mistakes begin to circulate, that becomes an opportunity for Trump to spin them into conspiracy theories. And we know he has again, kind of an established track record of doing that kind of thing.
Well, and the scenario you gave us as to how this could actually play out, where you look at one state, say Pennsylvania, one of the still this year a swing. Everyone considers Pennsylvania a swing state, uh, but obviously Pennsylvania is not the only state that has mail-in ballots. It's not the only state where we expect more people than ever to take advantage of mail-in. I mean, I was voting in the Pennsylvania Democratic primary or just the primary this year in June. I mailed in my ballot. I didn't want to go to a polling place. I could have, but it was just so easy. So that's going to play out in lots of states and in lots of swing states. And so if there's even something less than a hugely dramatic blue shift brought about by this increase in mail-in ballots, that's tremendous opportunity for uh, for Trump having laid the groundwork already to challenge the results in any number of important states in November.
Exactly. And in fact, just now to kind of complicate or to make even more or um, to trouble the dreams of your listeners even a little bit more, we can we can say that uh, four of the key swing states, so again, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and North Carolina, they all have the same political profile.
Yeah.
And this is really, really important. And by the same political profile, I mean they all have Republican controlled legislatures and Democratic governors.
Hmm.
And the reason that is a potentially incredibly destabilizing fact is that let's say Trump does insist that that he's lost a handful of these states. Again, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, these lost them as a result of the of fraudulent mail-in ballots. That you have to go with the November 3rd results. Well, it's very possible that those claims would gain traction with the GOP lawmakers in those states. And it's very possible to imagine that the GOP lawmakers would say, yes, what we're going to do is we're going to certify Trump's slate of electors. Um, and basically, that means that they're going to recognize Trump as having won the state as a result of the results of November 3rd. And we're going to give him the electoral votes from the state that is certify his slate of electors and send that on to Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also possible to imagine that the Democratic governors in those same states would say, no, 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 what are you doing? We have to accept the result of the final state canvass, which, again, making it up, we'll say wasn't done until November 15th or so. And I'm going to say that Biden won my state, and I'm going to certify his electoral slate, and I'm going to send it on to Congress. And that means that when Congress is the one that, by the terms of the Constitution, counts and accepts the electoral votes, and they will be doing this on January 6th, 2021, suddenly Congress is going to have competing electoral certificates in 3 states with the election in the balance. And again, some of your listeners might be thinking, well, here's a professor going off on some kind of wild Twilight Zone scenario. And again,
But
this
it's happened.
wild Twilight Zone scenario has already happened in our history. I mean, it
Right.
happened, for example, in 1876 in the famous Hayes-Tilden election, and it
Right.
almost, caused a complete meltdown of our political system. I don't know if your listeners just heard that thunder. That just
Yeah.
very appropriately accompanied
Just
my
to accent your
dire
point.
words.
Right.
Exactly. I always look for the heavens to accent my most dire warnings.
Right. Well, right. And I think most people probably, go to sleep at night. And in most election years, this is what happens. We know who the president is, and all of the formal steps that are part of the system that we have, where with the electors to the electoral college actually casting their votes, the states, each state then certifying results, those votes getting counted. I mean, all those steps happen, and in most election years, no one pays any attention to that. It's pretty pro forma, but it, as you describe in the book, it has happened in that election that you mentioned. And I think there was one other time too where there were, at least in a couple of cases, it didn't threaten the ultimate outcome of the election, but there were some electors who were challenged, and that where there were some irregularities. It wasn't just pro forma in each and every step of the way. But this year could be the year when the Republican-controlled legislature in Pennsylvania sends one result to Congress, and Governor Wolf, the Democrat, sends a different result. And then it's up to what happens in the Congress to figure out what happens next. Explain a little bit about how that could carry on the uncertainty in the ultimate outcome.
Yeah, right. And that really is the kind of that's the bad scenario. And unfortunately, as we've said, that kind of political profile of the states is the same kind of thing that we saw back in 1876, where you have again the split between Democrats and Republicans on the state that results in these competing certificates being sent on to Congress. And in 1876, when this happened, it really almost tore the country apart. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to go back and don't need to do a kind of refresher course on the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, but that um, that election dispute was only settled 2 days before the inauguration. And at the time, the incumbent president, Ulysses Grant, was so concerned that you would have 2 different people, Tilden on the one hand and Hayes on the other, each staging an inaugural ball or an inauguration on inauguration day, and you have 2 different people claiming to be commander in chief of the United States. That he was terrified about that prospect, and he considered declaring martial law. And again, it was only 2 days before the inauguration that the crisis was, so to speak, resolved. Um,
Well, but before you
After
then
that
go,
happened, yeah,
before you go on with that, Lawrence, and I'm saying this because I learned something reading the book, and I think if anybody is listening and thinking, "Oh, that election of 1876, who cares?" The outcome of this very twisted and convoluted situation, where President Ulysses Grant is thinking about martial law, the resolution of this, you should read Lawrence's book to understand, because it will help understand how Reconstruction, which had only just started in the South, came grinding to a halt. And that's really important to understand for other reasons in the times we're living in today. So I encourage you to actually go back into history and read Lawrence's description of that of that election, and how it relates to what we're talking about, but also how that ended up getting resolved. That's very important, and
yeah,
and
yeah.
not
Actually,
not just a minor footnote to what we're talking about here either.
no, that's exactly right, Aaron. And thanks for mentioning that, because it really is something where people say, "Oh, well, they resolved the crisis 2 days beforehand. That's nice. We averted some kind of disaster." But really, what it did is it ended Reconstruction, and if it solved the potential electoral catastrophe, it basically was a disaster for the African American population of the United States,
Right,
arguably, catastrophic for them. And we continue, and we obviously continue to see the legacy of that today.
right,
Um,
exactly.
and after that near total electoral meltdown in 1876, Congress got together and they said, "Well, we've got to figure out a way of how to deal with this thing if it happens again. That is, if we get competing electoral certificates from states." And so they spent the better part of a decade trying to draft some kind of legislative solution. And the solution they finally came up with, this Electoral Count Act of 1887, which I should emphasize, this is the law that would troubleshoot any problem that should arise in 2021. And I say 2021 because it's not until January that Congress meets to count the electoral certificates. But this law is incredibly deficient.
Hmm.
Um, you're also a lawyer, Aaron, and I defy you to make sense of the law. I mean, it is so confusingly drafted and so manifestly deficient in terms of the guidance that it supplies to Congress. And particularly if we have a scenario like we have now, if you have a divided Congress, and again, I'm just kind of working from the assumption that the House remains in the hands of Democrats and the Senate in the hands of Republicans. Um, at the time that come January 6th, when Congress is supposed to, in a relatively ceremonial function, count the electoral votes and declare the winner, you could easily imagine the Democrats in the House recognizing the governor's certificates from these swing states, giving Biden the the electoral votes of, let's say, again, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan. And you could imagine the Republican Senate saying, "No, no, no, we're recognizing Trump's electoral slates from those states." And then you have complete stalemate. You really have a gridlock, and there's no clear way out of that. And that really is that's a dangerous situation. Um,
Let me play out one last scenario, and then again, I just encourage everybody to get the book. It's about 120 pages, exquisitely sourced, so you can see where all the information is coming from. But in 120 pages, you're going to get the full story, and we'll tell people how to do that at the end. But help me understand one last scenario here, which actually has been mentioned a few times, but I don't know that anyone's ever explained how this could happen. We could end up with an acting president, Nancy Pelosi. How does that happen?
right. Well, so again, this is something which is it likely? It's not likely. Is it completely unlikely? No, it's not completely unlikely. And again, given the political profile in Washington today, it wouldn't take much to have the following things happen. So let's say Congress can't decide who to award these electoral certificates to because the Republicans want to give them, the Republicans in the Senate want to recognize Trump's certificates from these swing states, and the Democrats in the House want to recognize Biden's. Um, well, one thing that some of your listeners might think is, well, why doesn't the Supreme Court step in? They
Yeah.
stepped in Bush v. Gore. Why don't they step in now? And now that's actually very different. Once an election lands in the lap of Congress, um, many constitutional experts would say the Supreme Court has nothing to say at that point. That it really, again, with Bush v. Gore, they stepped in well before Congress got involved in this.
Hmm.
They stepped in to basically stop the recount in Florida. But once the electoral certificates land in Congress's lap come January 2021, most experts would say the Supreme Court has no role whatsoever to resolve an electoral dispute. Okay, so maybe at some point the members of Congress can't decide who won, and so no one has received the majority of electoral college votes. No one's received 270 votes. And then if we go back to the Constitution, then the election gets handed over to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives ends up electing the president. Now, some of your listeners might be thinking, well, that's fine for Biden.
Yeah.
And remember, again, this happened in the year 1800 and 1824 as well, when House of Representatives ended up electing the president because there's no one had received an electoral majority. But in fact, Biden wouldn't necessarily be elected for the following reason. So even though there are 235 Democrats in the House and 199 Republicans, and I think there's one vacancy at present, it's not that House members, according to the Constitution, House members do not get to vote for the president if the House is tasked with electing the president. It's each House delegation gets a single vote, just one vote. So California, with their huge delegation, gets one vote. Wisconsin, with their delegation of one, gets one vote. And right now, the Republicans have a slight lead in House delegations. They actually lead 26 to 23 with one delegation tied. So then you might say, oh, well, then Trump is going to get reelected if it goes to the House. And then again, we have to say not so fast, because it's not the present House that would be electing the president. It would be the House that itself is elected on November 3rd, 2020, and it's sworn in on January 3rd, 2021. And all you need is just for a few House seats to swing, and you could have the House delegations tied 25 to 25. And if they're tied 25 to 25, you have no president-elect. And then suddenly you could come to January 20th at noon and not have anyone have been elected. Now, again, there was another little scenario that we'd have to play out in the Senate, but basically we could kind of just say the same thing sort of happens there without getting too technical. But yeah, come
And then come January 20th, Trump is no longer president. He doesn't have enough electoral votes. The House hasn't been able to name him president. Pence is no longer the vice president. And in the absence of a president or a vice president, that's how you get to the Speaker of the House, right?
exactly. This is the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. So, assuming that she's willing to resign her seat, which is what the law would require, then Nancy Pelosi could be acting president. But of course, you probably also have to bear in mind that during this entire period, I mean, we're talking about from now November 3rd to January 20th. That's a long period of time for which Trump to be engaging in Twitter storms, and so it's a potentially incredibly destabilizing situation should that situation arise, in which he's saying, look, the Democrats are trying to steal my victory. Nancy Pelosi is basically trying to stage a coup. I've really been reelected president of the United States, and really kind of then engaging in this kind of true defiance.
Well, I'm saving my last question for last, but before I get to that last question, looking ahead, even to be able to have written this book and played out these different scenarios, and I'm sure you feel as I did reading about them, that it, as you said, it doesn't take much to see how each one of these steps actually could happen and put us in one of these meltdown scenarios. Um, there's been a lot of criticism of the Electoral College, as you say. Do you think, as a result of what has already happened this year and what may still happen over these next few months, do you see a growing concern enough about the Electoral College that we could see some real change to that? Or is that itself even more far fetched than some of these scenarios that you're playing
Right. Well, I think probably the following is very unlikely. I think it's very unlikely to see if you're really trying to get rid of the Electoral College, you'd have to do it by constitutional amendment. And if there's one area of the Constitution that's as dysfunctional as the Electoral College itself, it's the process by which we amend the Constitution.
out? Right.
Amending the U.S. Constitution, Article 5, which describes the amendment process, it's just simply too hard. It's too hard to amend the U.S. Constitution. And I think you'll find people on both sides of the aisle who agree with that. The late Supreme Court Justice Scalia believed that he thought if there was one part of the Constitution he would change, it would be the way we amend the Constitution, because he
Mhm.
thought it was just simply too hard. And there are these attempts to kind of engage in a legislative end run around the electoral college, and some of those are pretty promising. There's basically this kind of this attempt to create a pact among the states in which
Mhm.
states would basically assign their electoral college votes not on the basis of the statewide winner, but on the basis of the national vote winner. And that would, if you could get states whose electoral college votes amounted to at least 270 to sign on to that pact, then you'd basically make an effective end run around the electoral college, but that would be susceptible to constitutional challenge as well. It would be great to get rid of the electoral college, I think. It would be really terrific. But at best, it can be done legislatively, and even that's going to be very, very hard to do.
Okay, so then here I guess is the last question, and I know what my answer is, but there does seem to be an obvious way to avoid these meltdown scenarios and all of the unimaginably horrible consequences that could result from election aftermath chaos. Um, I mean, how do we avoid all this happening? Do you think?
Well, the again, without talking about long-term solutions,
Yeah, right.
if we just focus on 2020, the best way to avoid this is to hand Trump a decisive defeat. That
Right.
is the best way to, and again, a decisive defeat not simply in the popular vote, and again, not even necessarily just in the electoral college vote, but it has to be in the swing states themselves.
In
That the
each,
margins in the swing, exactly,
yeah.
exactly. Each swing state has to have a decisive enough margin of victory for Biden that Trump can't say, "Oh, well, it was just a result of these mail-in ballots coming in late um, that were all fraudulent or so." I think that is the best way to avoid the kinds of meltdown scenarios that I describe in the book. Um, that at least is what I hope will happen come this fall.
Well, and the only thing I would add to this, to what you said, and I think you do talk about this as well, the protective shield that Trump has had around him throughout his presidency has been the Republican-controlled Senate. But for a couple of votes in that Senate, he'd not only be impeached, he'd be removed from office by now. So, and there are, as Trump's numbers have been falling, you see a lot of very competitive Senate races this year that 6 months ago wouldn't have been thought of as being so competitive. So, if there's greater pressure on those Senate incumbents, those Republican incumbents, that could wear away some of the protection that he's enjoyed, so far, and that could make a difference.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I do think that, again, I suppose maybe there are two things to say about that. First is, if he does lose decisively, I do think that you will find the Republican support for him peel away. That is, I'm sure he'll again try to challenge the results, but I just don't think it's going to find traction among GOP lawmakers. The other thing also to point out is, if the Democrats actually do capture the Senate, then again Trump's and they hold on to the South, then again then Trump's ability to engage in the kind of real electoral defiance would be very dramatically limited, because even if the outcomes in swing states is very tight, and you do have that kind of somewhat of a crisis scenario that I described, in which you have competing certificates being sent by the states to Congress, then at least Congress could still recognize Biden's victory. That is, both houses of Congress recognizing that Biden has won, which is not to say that Trump again wouldn't try to challenge that result, and he might again be able to contribute to a substantial amount of civic unrest, but at least Congress would be unified in recognizing Biden's victory.
All right, so everybody, it's not just vote, but if your state allows early voting, vote early. Just vote once, but make sure you vote.
Yes, exactly.
And pick up a copy of Lawrence's book, just out. Will he go? Trump and the Looming Electoral Meltdown in 2020. I'm telling you, I read it yesterday, cover to cover. It was 120 pages, all of what we've been talking about and more. It will stick with you a long time, and when you tell your friends, they will see no other choice but to get out of vote this year, more than ever. We'll put a link in the description for this episode, so we'll make it very easy for people to get a copy of the book. And I want to thank Lawrence Douglas for being with us on the program today and spending time with us and walking us through some truly nightmarish scenarios, but ones that are far more possible than our nightmares actually coming through. So, Lawrence, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, really, it was a pleasure having this conversation with you, Aaron. Really terrific conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.